The morning of June 17, 2015, dawned with the quiet predictability of any other day at London Heathrow Airport. Terminal 5, British Airways' bustling hub, hummed with the steady rhythm of routine, passengers wheeling luggage across polished floors, flight attendants in crisp uniforms checking manifests, and ground crews guiding massive aircraft into their gates with practiced precision. Among the fleet stood British Airways Flight 762, a Boeing 777-200ER, its sleek silver and blue fuselage gleaming under the pale English sunlight. The aircraft, registered as GVEO, was a veteran of the skies, having logged thousands of hours, in service without incident. Today it was scheduled for a routine transatlantic journey to Phoenix, Arizona, carrying 157 passengers and 13 crew members. None of them could have known that within hours this flight would become the center of a harrowing mid-air emergency. Boarding proceeded without a hitch. Travelers settled into their seats, some already flipping through in-flight magazines, others nestling headphones over their ears, eager to lose themselves in movies or music. The cabin crew moved with the quiet efficiency of professionals, stowing bags, demonstrating safety procedures, and offering pre-departure beverages with practiced smiles. In the cockpit, Captain Mark Henderson and First Officer Rebecca Lang ran through their final checks, confirming fuel loads, weather reports, and flight paths. The skies were clear, the winds favorable. Conditions were, by all accounts, perfect for a smooth journey across the Atlantic. At precisely 10:42 a.m., the twin Rolls-Royce Trent 800 engines roared to life, their deep-throated whine vibrating through the cabin as the aircraft taxied toward runway 27L. Flight attendants took their positions, securing carts and double-checking seatbelts. The voice of Captain Henderson crackled over the PA system, his tone calm and reassuring as he welcomed passengers and announced their expected arrival time in Phoenix. Then, with a surge of power, the 777 accelerated down the runway, its nose lifting gracefully into the air as the sprawling urban landscape of London fell away beneath its wings. For the first hour, the flight was uneventful. The aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, slicing through the thin, cold air with effortless precision. Below, the patchwork of green English countryside gave way to the steel-grey expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was one of quiet contentment. A few passengers dozed, others sipped coffee, and the occasional murmur of conversation blended with the steady hum of the engines. The flight attendants began their first service, pushing carts laden with meals and drinks down the narrow aisles. Then, at 11:37 a.m., without warning, the calm shattered. A deafening explosion rocked the aircraft, a sound so violent it seemed to tear through the very fabric of the plane. In an instant, the cabin was plunged into chaos. Overhead bins rattled, oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, and a collective scream rose from the passengers as the Boeing 777 shuddered violently. Those seated on the left side of the aircraft would later describe seeing a fireball erupt from the number 1 engine, its orange glow visible even in the daylight. The force of the blast sent shrapnel tearing through the engine casing, and within seconds, the smooth purr of the Rolls-Royce Trent was replaced by a terrifying silence, followed by the sickening whine of metal grinding against itself as the damaged engine seized. In the cockpit, warning lights flashed across the instrument panel in a frenzied cascade. Master caution alarms blared, and the aircraft's electronic centralized aircraft monitoring ECAM system lit up with a cascade of dire messages. Engine failure, fuel leak, fire detected. Captain Henderson's hands tightened around the controls. As he felt the plane yaw sharply to the left, the loss of thrust on one side threatening to send the aircraft into an uncontrolled roll. Beside him, First Officer Lang immediately began running through emergency procedures, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The autopilot disengaged with a sharp chirp, forcing Henderson to take manual control as the 777, now unbalanced and sluggish, threatened to buck beneath his grip. Back in the cabin, panic spread like wildfire. Passengers clutched armrests, their faces pale with terror as the plane continued to tremble. A thick smell of burning metal and fuel seeped into the air, mingling with the acrid scent of fear. Flight attendants, trained for moments like this but never truly expecting them, moved swiftly, urging passengers to stay seated, assisting with oxygen masks, and preparing for the worst, even as they maintained an outward veneer of calm. One attendant, her hands trembling only slightly, reached for the interphone to contact the cockpit, her mind racing through emergency protocols. Outside, the damaged engine was a mangled wreck. The fan blades, warped and broken, had torn through the cowling, leaving jagged edges exposed to the rushing wind. Flames licked at the remaining structure, their heat intense enough to be felt. Through the fuselage, the fire suppression system activated automatically, flooding the engine with retardant, but the damage was already done. With one engine dead and the other straining to compensate, Flight 762 was now a wounded bird, its pilots fighting to keep it aloft. Captain Henderson's voice came over the PA again, this time stripped of its earlier ease. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have experienced an engine failure and are dealing with the situation. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, prepare for emergency landing procedures." The words were measured, deliberate, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. Every person on board understood the gravity of the moment. The Atlantic stretched endlessly below, a vast and unforgiving expanse. The nearest suitable airport was Shannon in Ireland, over 200 miles away. Could the crippled aircraft make it that far, or would the ocean become their grave? The passengers didn't know. The crew didn't know. All they could do was trust in the skill of the pilots, the resilience of the aircraft, and the slim, desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, they would survive. As Flight 762 limped toward the Irish coast, its fate hung in the balance. The next minutes would decide whether this day would be remembered as a near disaster or a tragedy etched forever into aviation history. The crippled Boeing 777-200ER shuddered violently as Captain Mark Henderson wrestled with the controls, his knuckles white against the yoke. The loss of the left engine had sent the aircraft into an immediate and dangerous asymmetry. Thrust from the remaining engine pulled the plane sharply to the left, forcing Henderson to apply constant right rudder just to keep the wings level. The flight deck was a storm of alarms. ECAM messages scrolled relentlessly across the screens, each one demanding attention, each one a reminder of how close they were to catastrophe. First Officer Rebecca Lang's fingers flew across the overhead panel, executing the engine fire checklist with mechanical precision, her voice steady as she called out each step. But behind her calm demeanor, a single thought pulsed like a warning. Beacon, they were too heavy. The aircraft, laden with fuel for a transatlantic crossing, was now a lumbering beast, its remaining engine straining against the imbalance. In the cabin, the initial shock had given way to a suffocating dread. Passengers gripped their armrests, their faces etched with terror as the plane continued its unsteady flight. Some prayed silently, others stared blankly at the safety cards in the seatbacks, as if the diagrams of flotation devices and emergency exits could offer some tangible hope. A child whimpered in his mother's arms, his small fingers clutching her sleeve. The flight attendants moved with deliberate calm, their training overriding their fear, but their eyes betrayed the truth. This was no drill. One attendant, a veteran with 20 years in the skies, discreetly tightened the straps of her jump seat, her mind involuntarily flashing to the crash simulations she had endured in training. "Brace for impact," Head down, stay low." The words echoed in her skull. Outside, the damaged engine was a smouldering ruin. The explosion had torn through the cowling, leaving twisted metal and exposed wiring in its wake. The fire suppression system had done its job. The flames were out, but the structural integrity of the engine was compromised. At any moment, another critical failure could send shrapnel ripping into the wing, severing fuel lines or hydraulic systems. The pilots knew it. The engineers on the ground, now frantically analyzing real-time data fed from the aircraft systems, knew it. Every second was borrowed time. Captain Henderson's gaze flicked between the altimeter and the navigation display. Shannon Airport was still 180 miles away. The plane was losing altitude, slowly but steadily. Without the full power of two engines, maintaining cruise altitude was impossible. He nudged the throttles forward, careful not to overstress the remaining engine, but the aircraft responded sluggishly, like a wounded animal struggling to keep pace. The fuel gauges told another grim story. The explosion had likely ruptured a line. They were burning through their reserves faster than expected. A cold realization settled over Henderson. They might not make it to Shannon. In the cabin, the oxygen masks swayed like morbid pendulums. The plane's sudden descent had triggered their release, and though the crew assured everyone the cabin was pressurized, the masks were a visceral reminder of their vulnerability. A businessman in 12A fumbled with his hands shaking too, badly to secure the elastic. Across the aisle, a young woman clutched her mask to her face, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The flight attendants moved among them, adjusting straps, offering terse words of reassurance, but their own masks hid their grim expressions. Back in the cockpit, First Officer Lang was on the radio with air traffic control, her voice clipped, but controlled. "Mayday, mayday, mayday, British Airways 762 declaring an emergency. We've lost the number 1 engine, possible fuel leak, requesting immediate diversion to Shannon." The response from Shannon Approach was instantaneous. Airspace cleared, emergency services alerted, runways prepared. But Lang's next transmission carried a new urgency. "We're not sure we can maintain altitude, requesting vectors for the most direct route." The plane lurched again, this time with a metallic groan that reverberated through the fuselage. A collective gasp rose from the passengers. Somewhere in the rear, a suitcase tumbled from an overhead bin, its thud startling those nearby into fresh panic. The flight attendants braced themselves against seats, their muscles tensed for what might come next. Captain Henderson's mind raced. They were still over the Atlantic, but the Irish coast was inching closer on the navigation screen. If they could just hold on a little longer. He glanced at Lang. No words were needed. Both knew the stakes. Both knew the unthinkable. Alternative. And then another alarm. A shrill, insistent chime. Lang's eyes snapped to the fuel gauge. Her breath caught. They were running out of time. The cockpit of British Airways Flight 762 had become a battleground of blinking lights, blaring alarms, and the overwhelming scent of stress. Captain Henderson's shirt clung to his back with sweat. As he fought to keep the aircraft stable, his muscles burning from the constant pressure needed to counteract the asymmetrical thrust. The remaining engine screamed in protest, its roar a stark contrast to the eerie silence from the left side of the plane. The fuel gauge needle trembled, edging closer to the red. "Fuel critical" flashed on the ECAM screen in bold, unignorable letters. First Officer Lang's voice cut through the chaos as she relayed updates to Shannon ATC, her tone stripped of anything but necessity. "Shannon BA 762, fuel emergency. We may not have enough for landing. Requesting priority handling and emergency services on standby." The response was immediate. Air traffic controllers scrambled to clear all other aircraft from their path, rerouting flights mid-descent to give the stricken 777 the shortest possible approach. In the cabin, The atmosphere had shifted from panic to a chilling, hollow silence. Passengers had stopped crying. Some held hands, others closed their eyes, lips moving in silent prayers. A flight attendant moved down the aisle, her voice steady but firm as she instructed everyone to assume the brace position. Feet flat, head down, hands over the back of the neck. The command was met with quiet obedience. No one argued, no one asked questions. The reality had settled in. They were going down, one way or another. Outside, the Atlantic's dark waves loomed closer than before. The plane was descending faster now, the pilots deliberately sacrificing altitude to conserve fuel. The Irish coastline was visible on the horizon, a thin green strip of land that seemed both agonizingly close and impossibly far. The aircraft's systems, overtaxed and damaged, groaned under the strain. Hydraulic pressure warnings flickered intermittently, and the flight controls responded with increasing sluggishness. Then the right engine sputtered. A violent shudder racked the plane as the remaining Rolls-Royce Trent coughed, its roar stuttering, for one terrifying second before surging back to life. Captain Henderson's jaw clenched. 1 more minute, just 1 more minute. The fuel warning now blared continuously, an unrelenting siren of impending disaster. Shannon Airport's runway lights appeared in the distance, the landing gear lowered. With a heavy thud, its hydraulics protesting but holding. The flaps extended in increments, each notch increasing drag, but slowing their speed, precious knots they couldn't afford to lose. The altimeter unwound rapidly, 5,000 feet, 4,000, 3,000. And then, silence. The right engine flamed out. The sudden loss of power sent a jolt through the aircraft. The cockpit lights dimmed as the plane switched to backup systems. Henderson's grip on the yoke tightened. They were now a glider, a 200-ton metal bird with nothing but momentum and gravity keeping it in the air. The runway was there, right there. But the plane was sinking too fast. The ground rushed up to meet them. The final seconds stretched into an eternity as the crippled Boeing 777 hurtled toward Shannon's runway 24. Without engine power, the aircraft was a dead weight, its descent angle dangerously steep. Captain Henderson's entire body tensed, his instincts and training screaming at him to pull up. But physics had taken over. There was no energy left to arrest the fall. The altimeter unwound in a blur. 500 feet, 300, 200. A sudden crosswind buffeted the plane, tilting it slightly to the left. Henderson corrected instinctively, his hands moving with the precision of a man who knew that one wrong input could doom them all. The runway loomed ahead, its emergency vehicles already in position, lights flashing in silent alarm. The threshold passed beneath them, too fast, far too fast. Then, impact. The main landing gear struck the tarmac with a force that sent a shudder through the entire airframe. A deafening screech of metal filled the cabin as the tires, overloaded by the aircraft's weight and speed, blew out instantly. The right wing dipped, its tip grazing the runway in a shower of sparks. For one heart-stopping moment, the plane threatened to veer off the pavement, but Henderson stomped on the rudder pedal, fighting to keep the nose aligned. The rear wheels slammed down next, the fuselage bending under the strain. Overhead bins burst open, raining luggage onto the passengers below. Oxygen masks swung wildly. Somewhere in the cabin a child screamed. The brakes, applied with full force, groaned in protest, their discs glowing red-hot as they struggled to arrest the aircraft's momentum. Outside, the runway's emergency foam sprayers activated, coating the asphalt in a slick white blanket to reduce friction and prevent fire. Fire trucks raced alongside the careening jet, their crews poised for the worst. The plane's speed bled off slowly, too slowly. The end of the runway approached at an alarming rate, the grassy, overrun area beyond it offering little safety. For a 777 at this velocity. Then finally, the nightmare began to slow. The nose gear collapsed with a sickening crunch, the aircraft lurching forward as its nose scraped along the ground. More sparks flew, but there was no explosion, no fire. The foam had done its job. With a final shuddering halt, British Airways Flight 762 came to rest just meters short of the runway's end, its battered frame tilted forward like a wounded animal. For a moment there was silence, then chaos erupted. Flight attendants, some bruised but unbowed, sprang into action, shouting commands to evacuate. Overwing exits were flung open, inflatable slides deploying with a hiss. Passengers surged toward the exits, their movements frantic but orderly. Years of safety briefings had ingrained the procedures even in their terror. A woman stumbled, only to be yanked upright by a fellow traveler. An elderly man hesitated at the slide's edge before launching himself down, his face a mask of grim determination. Outside, emergency crews swarmed the aircraft. Foam cannons trained on the still smoldering left engine. Medics rushed to assist those already on the ground, their eyes scanning for injuries. Miraculously, there were no flames, no secondary explosions. The evacuation continued at a breakneck pace, each second a gift. Within minutes it was over. The last passenger slid to safety just as the first raindrops began to fall, the Irish weather offering an almost poetic closure to the ordeal. The crew, now gathered at a safe distance, took their first unsteady head counts. 170 souls, all alive. Captain Henderson stood in the drizzle, his uniform torn, his hands shaking. He stared at the wreck of his aircraft, the twisted metal, the scarred runway, the remnants of an engine that had nearly killed them all. Then he turned to his first officer, his voice barely above a whisper. The rain fell harder now, turning the foam-covered tarmac into a slick, surreal landscape. Emergency lights painted the scene in pulsing reds and blues, their reflections dancing in the puddles forming around the wrecked Boeing 777. The aircraft sat crippled but intact, its nose pressed into the ground like a kneeling giant. Around it, the organized chaos of the response unfolded, firefighters securing the area, paramedics triaging passengers, and airline personnel clutching clipboards, their faces tight with the grim focus of post-disaster protocol. Captain Henderson stood apart from it all, his body rigid, his eyes locked onto the plane. His mind replayed the last moments in the cockpit, the alarms, the shuddering controls, the way the runway had rushed up to meet them with terrifying speed. He could still feel the yoke vibrating in his hands, the resistance of the aircraft as it fought against his commands. The adrenaline that had sustained him during the emergency had drained away, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion. Nearby, First Officer Lang sat on the bumper of an emergency vehicle, a shock blanket draped over her shoulders. Her fingers absently traced the edge of the foil material, her gaze distant. She had done everything right. Every checklist, every call-out, every adjustment, and yet the weight of what could have happened pressed down on her like a physical force. A medic offered her a bottle of water, and she took it without really noticing, the plastic cool against her palm. In the terminal, passengers huddled in groups, some crying, others laughing with the giddy relief of the unexpectedly spared. A young boy clutched a stuffed airplane to his chest, his wide eyes fixed on the television screens, where news outlets were already broadcasting images of the damaged jet. His mother rocked him gently, her own tears leaving dark spots on his shirt. Across the room, a businessman stared at his phone, his thumb hovering over the call button. He had texted his wife during the descent. Engine trouble. Might be bad. I love you. And now, faced with the reality of survival, he couldn't bring himself to dial. The airline's crisis team moved among the survivors, offering reassurances, blankets, and promises of rebooked flights. Their professionalism was a thin veneer over their own shock. Mechanical failures like this weren't supposed to happen, not in this day and age, not to them. Outside, the investigation was already beginning. A team from the Air Accidents Investigation Branch, AIB, had been dispatched, their high-vis jackets stark against the grey sky. They circled the wreckage, cameras flashing, voices low and serious. The engine, what was left of it, would be pored over, every fracture analyzed, every system scrutinized. Answers would be demanded, blame would be assigned. But for now, there was only the quiet, drizzling aftermath. Henderson finally turned away from the plane. His first steps were unsteady, his legs uncooperative. A colleague approached, hand outstretched, but the captain waved him off. He needed a moment, just one moment. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, a reminder that the world was still moving, that life went on. But for those who had been on Flight 762, nothing would ever be the same.